And good morning to everyone. Today we will see a couple of interesting tips and tricks that will make you working with 3ds Max and lights in 3ds Max in a better way, I hope. First simple trick is, if you want to see effect of lights directly in your viewport, what we have to do is simply we have to click here where in general we see standard as setting. We have to click standard, we have to go to lighting and shadows, and we have to change two simple parameters. Parameter number one is we have to click illuminate with scene lights, and by clicking on the same menu again, and by going again to lighting and shadows, we have to enable shadows. In this way, if I create a very simple setup, a very simple scene where I have a floor and some walls here and there, okay. Okay, so now by simply setting those parameters, if I place a light in my project, no matter which light it will be, I will see immediately in real time the behavior of light. So if I move it here and there, if I change parameter, intensity, let's say I make it 800 candles, I immediately see that it is decreasing its intensity. If I change the filter color, this will happen in real time without waiting rendering. Next one is dimensions. So this light in this environment is working correctly. If I increase or decrease intensity, I can correctly see that light is responsive. Sometimes it happens simply that if my project has been made without checking dimensions, so let's say maybe I've imported a file and I have completely missed units, or I'm not working with units, and we'll see this in a second. So if my object is too tiny or too big, let's start with the too tiny one. When I place a light in here, no matter what I change in this light, but I will see that this light will remain super crazy bright, and to make my my project with a decent light, I have to basically set the intensity almost to 0 or values pretty close to 0, and also it suddenly changes from slightly bright to boom, immediately super bright. And this is simply because my object, my room in this case, has completely wrong dimensions. Same exact thing, just with the opposite problem. So if I shift and move and I scale this room up so that it becomes gigantic, I will just place it somewhere else. Perfect. But if I place a light in here, no matter where I place it, but this light will start behaving like its intensity, it will be never enough. So if I start changing intensity of light, I can see that in order to get a decent amount of light, I have to use crazy parameters of light. In this case, I have to crank up this to 30,000 candles. Okay? But in this way, none of my lights will correctly work. So even the daylight will completely have a wrong behavior. And if we want to be sure that we are working with right dimensions and with units as well, there are two simple options that we need to use inside 3ds Max. There are, first of all, we have to go to the menu that is Customize, and we need to go to Unit Setup, and here we need to switch the one that basically is always the default option. That is, when we start first time 3ds Max, we see that we are always with generic units. We have to change these. We have to choose whatever unit we want, the one that we like, but it has to be a unit. So we can choose between the metric system into all units like millimeters, centimeters, meters, or kilometers, or the US standard, and here we can choose between inches, feet, inches and feet with fractions or decimal, the one that you prefer. But now, let's say I like centimeters. This is first, and then if I want to check if dimensions of my projects are fine, I have not to rely on selecting the object and going to the Modify tab and reading these dimensions, because these are parameters. And if I scale my object, dimensions won't change. But what changes at the end is the final real dimension that I can instead easily measure by selecting the object or multiple objects at the same time. I can go to the tab that is called Utilities. I will click Measure, and down here I have to move my head a little bit, so let's move instead this on the other side. Exactly. What I see here is that my dimensions will tell me exactly how big this object is, no matter if I change dimensions of my objects by using scale or by changing parameters. And what I see inside Measure tool is I will have always realistic dimension of my object. I can also have these as floating menu here, so that even if I change my active tool, I can always have a look at real dimension of my object. And this also works if I select more objects together, and if I go to Measure, dimensions that I see written here are maximum dimensions of my entire selection, so which is bigger dimension from X to X point, Y to Y, Z to Z. And this is another interesting thing that we need to keep in mind when we work with lights. There are dimensions. Another interesting thing that happens when we work with lights is that we need to always keep an eye on the exposure of our virtual camera. There are two ways to manage exposure, basically, or you use a physical camera, and physical camera has exposure control that is built in each camera, so each camera you can have different exposures, or you can control exposure by going to Rendering, Exposure Control, and you can instead change this value here, the one inside global exposure, okay? And this is very simple. The way it works will be, if you increase this value, exposure will go down, so it will be a darker final image. If you lower this value, your final image will be brighter. And this also will be visible in our viewport if we have correctly set our viewport parameters at the beginning. And then let's see another interesting tool, that is when we work in 3ds Max with different kind of lights, and especially when we are using in our project sun positioner. A very common mistake is adding sun positioner and then start complaining about sun positioner because everything went white. And the only thing that instead is wrong right now, as I was saying before, is the exposure value. So what happens now is that because our exposure was previously set in order to work with artificial lights, now by using sun positioner, we simply need to go to rendering, go to exposure control, and we need to increase global exposure value in order to find which one is right by using this new light source. And again, we will see the effect in our viewport. And if we also want to have a better understanding of how our rendering is going to look like once that we will press rendering button, we can click this tiny button here called render preview, and we will have a very small preview that will tell us exactly how our rendering will be. Each time that we change our perspective, we have to click again render preview. But if we simply want to adjust the exposure instead, render preview will automatically change. And even there, it will show you real-time results. And this is about exposure. Okay, so next one is when we want to make an interior scene and we want both kind of lights being visible. Light coming from the sun and artificial lights. In general, a very common scenario is when you have an interior with light coming from a window and there are in general spotlights that are illuminating the scene. So what I will do is I will quickly complete this project. I mean, nothing fancy, just to give you the idea. So I will close the room and I will open a window by using a box in here and by using ProBoolean to cut the window. So click start picking, pick these, perfect. Then I will also change a little bit the hour of the day so that I will have a more visible sunlight coming in from this window. So I select my sun positioner and I will simply change the hour of the day more or less like this, and I will create a camera so that I can see the project from the inside. So I go to create, I go to camera, let's say a target camera, place it here, perfect. And now to switch to the camera view, I click perspective, cameras, camera 1. Of course, this is on the ground, so I can quickly use my middle button to change the height of the camera and the target together. And I will also make my field of view a little bit wider so that I can see more in here. About okay, a 20mm lens. This is more than enough. So now it happens this. If I go to rendering, exposure control, and I click render preview, I will see something that won't work properly, because I will see that outside my exposure is fine. Inside, because the only place that I am using in order to have the advantage of the sun outside is this little hole. So I have to decrease exposure to make the inside of this room becoming brighter. Let's say something like that. Also, don't mind about my walls that are blue. So now, which is the problem? The problem is that with this value of exposure, that is about 10, let's say write 10.2, just to have a simple number to calculate. Now, with this exposure, I can see that my light is basically not doing anything inside my project. Let's say this is a spotlight maybe, and I change the distribution to spotlight. I can see that even if I place these next to my wall, I mean, it has to be basically attached to the wall to see just this very small light effect in here. So, something that happens is when we change the exposure, we need also to balance light intensity according to our new modified exposure value. So if I create, let's say, more lights in order to make these even more visible, maybe 6 are even more than enough, but if I make this render, this light won't be that interesting or that visible. So in this case, when I want to see both light from outside and artificial light turned on together, I need to really increase a lot the intensity of my lights. And in general, 10,000 candles is a pretty decent number to keep in mind, and this will work. Okay? And this is when you want to use light from outside and light from inside, both visible and both turned on. Okay, naturally from here we can see next very common mistake to be considered when we work with lights in 3ds Max. That is, what happens if we want to delete our sun positioner and we just want to work with artificial lights in our scene. So I will just go in my perspective view and I will simply do what everyone does. That is, I will just select my sun positioner, I will hit delete, I will also delete this light that is outside, and I go back to my camera view. And I can see now that my room is a little bit darker. I have no direct light coming from the window, so I go to rendering, I go to exposure control, I click render preview, and I will see something weird happening here. That is, my scene basically looks the same. It is just missing that direct light from the window, but the entire room is still bright, and especially the outside is still super bright. So why this is happening? This is happening simply because when we create our sun positioner, we automatically add something called the sky and map on the environment parameter, and this is true for basically all render engines that we use. So this is true even if we are not just using ART renderer, but even if we use V-Ray or Corona render. So basically we need to manually get rid of this additional map. So by going to environment, to exposure control, or same thing, environment and effects, when we remove sun positioner, then we need also to manually right click to this map and click clear, so that in this way we have not only removed the sun positioner as direct light source, but we have also removed the dome, that is the sky, that was giving indirect, so ambient light to our project. Okay? Let's see other simple tools that you can use in order to make your life easy when you work with lights. There are, first of all, we can go to tools and we can find this tool called Light Lister. And what we have here is basically we have a summary of all lights that we have in our project. In my case right now, you can see again something that for many of my students is considered a mistake, and one of common question that is, I can see that I have 6 or 7 lights, but in this tool I can see only 1 light listed. And if this happens, is simply because when I have created my lights, I have created them by using instance. So they are seen as the repetition of same exact object. But what we find in Light Lister is we have a few simple parameters that we can quickly change even if we don't select the actual light from the scene. So we can simply and quickly turn our light on and off, and because they are instances, they will all have same behavior. We can change the intensity directly from here, and again, because they are instances, they will all change together. So maybe I type 2000 and you will see that they will all change. You can also quickly change their color. And even if I do not recommend to do this, you can also change the algorithm to create the shadow, even if I highly recommend to leave ray trace shadow. Another thing that you can do instead is by clicking this tiny button next to on, you can select your lights without clicking them from the project itself, and also because they are all instances, by clicking this button I have selected them all. If I have more lights, so if I have, for example, another light and then I create another one, you can see that at the very beginning it looks like Light Lister got stuck. In reality, when we add more lights, we need simply to hit refresh into the Light Lister, so that Light Lister will show new lights that we have just added. And again, light by light, we can use this little button on the left to select lights. And we see the name next to the light that we are selecting. We can turn on and off lights directly from here. We can change their colors. And we can, for example, create our nice looking setup directly from Light Lister. This would be pretty handy when our project is crowded by a lot of stuff, decorations, furniture, light fixtures, and many other objects. And last but not least is this. If we want to make certain transformations to our lights, so we need to select them, maybe we want to rotate them, and in this case, especially when a project is filled with a lot of stuff, it becomes extremely annoying to go and start by using, let's say, Control and click to select only those lights that we want to modify, maybe delete, maybe we want to rotate them, to change where they are projecting light. It is pretty common instead that when we select this light by mistake, for example, we can select unwanted elements, like we can select the wall in here, the wall in there, and let's say I want to just delete these lights. By mistake, I've selected the wall. I hit delete, and I have to, in general, go back, undo, deselect everything, and this is pretty annoying. So, to avoid these kind of problems, if I want just to select my lights and I don't want to be bothered by selecting other stuff, I can use this menu here on my main toolbar, where I can see by default the word all, and this is my selection filter. And again, by default is always set to be all. That means whenever I make a selection, I will select whatever kind of object is inside that selection window. But if I open this menu and I change this option to lights, now if I make my selection window, even if my selection is clearly intersecting two walls and the floor, in this case all those objects that are not lights won't be selected at all, and I will be able just to quickly select only my lights, no matter which other objects are crossing or inside my selection window. Okay? So, if you find this video useful or you like it, hit the like button, subscribe, leave me a comment about which problems you have in 3ds Max, and I would like to see if I will be able to solve it. And as I usually say, for now, have fun. Bye.